poor little rich girl. Rich but poor. And that's the very situation that we're dealing with in this psalm. Now I want to suggest 4 reasons why she was the poor little rich girl, and why the man in this psalm is a poor rich man. 4 reasons why that's the case. First of all, it's the case because there are some things that money cannot buy. There are some things that money cannot buy. Notice the psalmist talks about, beginning in verse 6, they that trust in their wealth and boast themselves in the multitude of their riches, none of them can by any means redeem his brother, nor give to God a ransom for him. For the redemption of their soul is precious, and it ceaseth forever, that he should still live forever and not see corruption. Now the psalmist here is talking about an Old Testament custom, an Old Testament practice whereby a man could redeem his brother. If a brother was sold, if a brother was poor, wasn't capable of paying for the redemption, then a brother could do that for him, could redeem him. Now there were some who could not be redeemed. A murderer, for example, could not be redeemed. But if a brother became poor and sold his land, you could redeem that land for your brother. If he had the money, he could redeem it as well. And so that was the idea of redemption. But in this passage, we find that none of them, literally no one, no matter how rich they are, can by any means redeem his brother. And that is talking about it in a spiritual sense. He can't redeem, he can't buy back his brother's soul. It doesn't matter how much money he has. Redemption in that sense cannot be bought. It cannot be paid for. Nor give to God a ransom for him. There's no way you can pay the ransom for that brother's soul. In verse 8 we find, for the redemption of their soul is precious. Literally, it costs more than you can pay. No man has enough to pay for the redemption of the soul. There is only one person in all human history that was able to pay for the redemption of the soul, and that was Jesus Christ. No other man in human history could ever pay that price. He's the only one that could pay it, and he could only pay it because he was a sinless man. He had committed no sins, and therefore he could take the place of those who had committed sins. Had he been a sinner, then he would have been powerless to redeem himself, much less anyone else. But because he was sinless, he had the power of redemption. He could be our near kinsman, and he could redeem us because he was qualified to be our Redeemer. Now in 1 Peter chapter 1, you recall that Peter is going to tell us, for as much as you know that you were not redeemed with corruptible things, such as silver and gold. You weren't redeemed with silver and gold. Why? Because no amount of money can pay for the redemption of the soul. No amount of silver, no amount of gold can do that. Now what does Peter tell us is the only thing that could pay for the redemption of the soul? Precious blood of Christ, the blood of a lamb, without spot and without blemish. That's the only thing that could pay that price. Nothing else could pay it. No amount of silver, no amount of gold. And so there are some things that money simply cannot buy. And so when we think about the poor little rich girl, there were some things that money could not buy. Money could not buy a happy marriage. Money could not buy health. Money could not buy eternal life. Money couldn't buy any of those things. It could buy nicer houses. It could buy nice cars and nice clothes. But it couldn't buy any of those other things. Because money can't buy that. There are some limitations when it comes to money. You know, no matter how rich a man may be, he can't buy health. Oh, he can go to the finest hospitals. He can find the finest doctors. He can pay drug companies for medicines that maybe others cannot afford. But he cannot buy health. It just isn't possible. Money can't do that. Even the rich get sick. Even the rich have diseases that cannot be cured, no matter how much money they have. Well, that's an important point for us to understand about money, and he's trying to help us to solve this riddle. Now, here's what someone has said about money. Money will buy you a bed, but not sleep. Books, but not brains. Food, but not appetite. Finery, but not beauty. A house, but not a home. Medicine, but not health. Luxuries, but not culture. Amusements, but not happiness. Religion, but not salvation. A passport to everywhere but heaven. Some things that money simply can't buy. That's the first thing that we have to understand. Now, the second thing that we have to understand is, in the second place, all men die, but only the righteous live again. All men die. Even the rich die. Even Donald Trump one day is going to die. All men die, rich or poor. Just because you have a lot of money, it won't mean that you can pay off death. Death cannot be bribed. Death cannot be bought off. Death comes to the rich and to the poor. We can name the Rockefellers. We can name the Vanderbilts. We can name the Astors. We can name the rich people who have lived. And we can today go and see their mansions. We can today still know their names because of the wealth that they one time commanded. But they're no longer here. They're gone. Death came to them in spite of all the money that they had. Now, notice in the context, beginning in verse 10, "For he seeth that wise men die, likewise the fool and the brutish person perish, and leave their wealth to others." Here's this rich man, and he sees this. He sees that wise men die. He sees that fools die. Literally, he sees that all men die. But what is he thinking in his mind? I'm the exception to that. Not going to happen to me. He's the exception to every other rule. That applies to this man and that applies to that man, but it doesn't apply to me because of how much money I have. I'm in a different category than what he is or than what she is. But when it comes to death, he's not in a different category. But it's easy when you're rich to think that you are. Notice in verse 11, their inward thought is. He says they see other people die, but here's what he's thinking on the inside. He's thinking, my wealth is going to continue. What I've amassed, what I've built is always going to be here. It's not going anywhere. Nothing's going to happen. It is going to continue throughout generations. It's amazing, isn't it, that people can see something and yet not see it. That they can have evidence all around them of something and yet somehow miss it. And yet we do that. People can have evidence. You think about those who gamble. And they go and they put their money down. And what do they see happening all around them? Oh, they may occasionally see somebody win. But what do they see more than anything else? People losing. This person lost, that person lost, that person lost. They see that all around them. But what do they convince themselves? They see losing all around them. They see it. But that's not going to be me. I'm going to win. They see people all around them dying. But that's not going to be me. I'm going to be the exception to that. There are some things to which we will not be the exception. And that's certainly true when it comes to death. Think about it as well in verse 11. Their inward thought is that their houses shall continue forever, and their dwelling places to all generations. They call their lands after their own names. They speak of and they think of this life as permanent. You know, one of the things that Jennifer and I do whenever we go back to a place where we've been before We always try to find time to do this. Most of the time we do. We go by where we used to live. You ever done that? You can drive by your old house and you just want to see it again. Part of you's there. You lived there for however many years, and maybe your children were born there. Maybe that was the first house you lived in when you got married. And you want to go by and you want to see it. But it's not your house anymore, is it? We talk about it that way still. Let's go by and see our house. It's not our house. We knocked on the door and said, I want to come in and see my house. It wouldn't go over very well, would it? If we got out in the yard and started taking pictures, very likely somebody would come out and say, what are you doing? I'm taking pictures of my house. Excuse me? Your house? I make a payment every month on this. It's my house. This is the nature of houses, right? They're not ours forever. Land, not ours forever. Places where we have been, but they pass. And this rich man, he doesn't see it that way. He thinks it's going to be forever. Nevertheless, man being in honor abideth not. Here's an honorable man. Here's a man who receives the accolades and the praises of people, but he doesn't abide. He doesn't last forever. He abideth not. He is like the beasts that perish. Now, here the psalmist is not saying that everything about our death is the same as the death of the beast. A beast does not possess an immortal soul. So there are some differences when we die and when an animal dies. We know that. But what he is saying is just as animals die, we die. Just as the dumb beast ends at death, we're going to die too. We're going to suffer that consequence. Now we're going to live on somewhere, but that's going to happen. That's what his point is right here. Now Hebrews 9 in verse 27 says, it is appointed unto man once to die, and after this the judgment. And so death is an appointment. And it's an appointment for the rich man as much as it is for the poor man. And it will come to him. He can't buy it off. He can't in any way escape that. It's coming for him just as much as for the other man. I think it's a good habit to be in, to maybe on a monthly basis, at least periodically, to read Genesis chapter 5. I really think it is. It'll do you good, not only because you have to say some names and have to pronounce some names, and it's good for you to go through the process of doing that. But you know what you'll read 8 times in that chapter? You'll read about people who lived an extremely long time. Some of them lived up into the 900s. But they all end with the same 3 words. And he died. He lived 969 years. And he died. And he died. That's what the psalmist is trying to get us to see. Yes, he had millions of dollars. But he died. Yes, he had houses here and houses there and lands here and lands there. Yes, he had a summer home and a winter home and he had this, but he died. It's true of every man. Every man will die. Psalm 49 in verse 15, if you notice, what the psalmist is suggesting here is that the rich man dies, but the poor man also dies. But in verse 15, he says, but God will redeem my soul from the power of the grave, for he shall receive me. All men die, but only the righteous live again. Now, I'm not meaning to suggest by that the wicked die and it's over. The Bible doesn't teach that. The Bible teaches that all are going to come forth. They that have done good to the resurrection of life, they that have done evil to the resurrection of damnation, John 5:28 and 29. So all men are going to come forth. But those who are wicked and come forth, they don't come forth to eternal life. In fact, what is described of them is that they suffer everlasting destruction, everlasting death. They die, and death continues in an eternal sense for them. Not soul sleeping. No, they're very aware of their surroundings. They're in torment. They're suffering there. But they don't live. Not in the sense that those that go to heaven do, because they suffer death eternally, where we enjoy life eternally. And here's what the psalmist is talking about. This is an early reference to immortality and to the resurrection. He says God's going to redeem his soul. The rich man, he can't redeem his soul. He can't redeem any other man's soul. We can't redeem our own soul. But guess who can redeem our soul? Well, God can. And if we serve God, God will redeem us. Nobody else can do that, but God can do that. And God will do that for us. From the power of the grave, for he shall receive me. God's going to take me. That's what the word receive here means. God's going to take me. God's going to redeem me. He's going to buy me back from death. And He's going to take me to live with Him. He's going to receive me to glory. He's going to receive me to heaven. In Genesis chapter 5 and verse 24, we read about Enoch. This is the language used of Enoch. And he was not for what? God took him. God received him. The psalmist says the same thing here. God is going to take me. God's going to receive me. I'm going to live with Him. In 2 Kings chapter 2 and verse 10, we read concerning Elijah. But notice Psalm 73 and verse 24. This great expression about the afterlife for those of us who serve God. Psalm 73 and verse 24. Thou shalt guide me with thy counsel, and afterward receive me to glory. Now that word afterward is an important word. Afterward. You see, it's not all about this life. We have to think about afterward. We have to think about what comes after this. And we have to think about what God will do for us after this if we do what we're supposed to do right here, right now. Hebrews 11 and verse 5, we again read that language concerning Enoch, but it becomes an example for us in realizing that likewise God will one day take us if we are obedient to Him. I found this statement and I thought it was very interesting. I think it hits the modern mindset. Exchanging tents and camels for houses and automobiles makes us nonetheless strangers. You know, we don't feel as much as strangers as maybe people in days gone by did. You know, if you dwell in a tent and you ride on a camel, this life seems kind of temporary. But when you dwell in a mansion and drive a fine automobile, it doesn't seem quite as temporary. Abraham knew of the temporary nature of this life. He dwelled in a tent. He rode on a camel. He was a stranger. And Hebrews chapter 11 tells us that he confessed that he was a stranger. He confessed that he was a pilgrim. He gladly said that. He knew of the temporary nature of this life. Sometimes we forget that because we don't dwell in a tent and we don't ride on a camel. We think that we're going to be here forever because we dwell in a house that has a foundation. We ride in an automobile that just goes and goes and goes. And life doesn't seem quite as temporary when that's the case. But we're still strangers and pilgrims. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11. But I want you to think about a third thing that the psalmist wants us to see, and that is that you can't take it with you. You can't take it with you. Psalm 49, verses 16 through 18, the psalmist says that you can't take it with you. It says, Be not thou afraid when one is made rich, when the glory of his house is increased. For when he dieth, he shall carry nothing away. His glory shall not descend after him. Though while he lived, he blessed his soul, and men will praise thee when thou doest well to thyself. Notice verse 18, we have those words, while he lived. Here's what was true of him while he lived. But the psalmist is telling us about what was true of him after he died. While he lived, he did well. He did extremely well, and men praised him for his invention. They praised him for his wisdom. They praised him for his riches. But that was while he lived. When he dieth, according to verse 17, he shall carry nothing away. He can't take any of it with him. You ought to underline, highlight that word nothing. Nothing. Now I realize that sometimes when people die, things are buried with them. There are those who have been buried in their cars. But they're not driving those cars. There were those that were buried with rings and watches and jewelry. Not doing anything good for them now. No meaning now for them. They didn't take that with them. Oh, it's in the ground, but it didn't go with them to the other side. You know, the Egyptians who lived thousands of years ago, you know what the pharaohs thought? Tutankhamun? They took all the gold, took all the things that they needed in the afterlife. Tutankhamun's tomb, he had chariots. He might need a chariot in the afterlife. He might need arrows and a bow in the afterlife. He might need this or that. But you know, Howard Carter came along and opened that tomb. And all of those things were unused. Pharaoh hadn't used a single one of them. And he wasn't ever going to. It was all still right there. He couldn't take it with him. An Egyptologist, James Breasted, who examined that discovery, said it was the greatest discovery of wealth in one place of all time. He suggested that it would take 10 years just to catalog the riches that were in that tomb. 10 years. But he didn't take a single thing with him. You know, Elvis, if you've ever been to Graceland, they'll tell you what was buried with Elvis. Elvis didn't use that watch. Elvis didn't use that ring. It may have made those who put him there feel better, sending it with him. But that isn't something that he was able to take to the other side. We can't take anything to the other side. Job chapter 1 and verse 21, Job says, naked came I into this world, and naked I'll go forth. You know, when you came into the world, you came in without a stitch of clothing on. Every one of us did. We didn't come in wearing a robe. We didn't come into this world in designer clothes. We came into this world without anything. And Job suggested that will be true as well. Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 15. Notice what the wise men said. He's trying to give us wisdom, just as the psalmist is right here. As he came forth of his mother's womb, naked shall he return to go as he came, and shall take nothing of his labor, which he may carry away in his hand. You know how many people have died with something precious in their hands? Pompeii, have you ever seen the discovery of Pompeii? As men were running from the eruption of Vesuvius, they had pearls and gold and all types of precious things. And when they were buried in those ashes, those precious jewels are still right there in their hands. They didn't carry it. They didn't get away with it. And we won't get away with it in this life. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verses 6 and 7 says, we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain that we can take nothing out. The only way that we'll have anything in the world to come is if we are laying it up right now, because we cannot take it with us when we die. Matthew chapter 6 and verses 19 and 21. One final point, and that is, position here doesn't always follow in the world to come. Now, if you look at Psalm 49, you'll see his position here. In verse 18, while he lived, he blessed his soul. While he lived, men praised him. Verse 19, he shall go to the generation of his fathers. They shall never see light. Now I take it this man didn't have any trouble paying his power bill in this life. But he'll never see light again. There are maybe people in this world who have trouble paying the power bill, but they're going to a place where there will be no night. But there are those that pay every bill without any trouble in this life, and yet they're going to a place where there will be nothing but darkness. And that's true of this man. Man that is in honor and understandeth not is like the beast that perish. He's perishing just like the beast. He doesn't understand the lessons that are being taught right here. You remember the rich man in Luke chapter 16? The difference between the rich man and Lazarus? He fared sumptuously every day, and he had all of these things. Lazarus didn't have any of those things. But what happened in eternity? The rich man, he was rich in this life, and he was rich in... No, he was rich in this life, but he wasn't rich there. He was comfortable here, but he wasn't comfortable there. You see how things were reversed? We have to understand that just because we're rich here doesn't mean we'll be rich there. Just because we're comfortable here does not mean we'll be comfortable there. We have to make the right choices, the right decisions. Just because men praise us here doesn't mean that God will praise us there. We have to live the right kind of lives. Thank you very much for your attention tonight.